Night on the Mongolian steppe was unlike night anywhere else. No city walls, no flicker of torches against stone battlements, only a vast black sky spangled with stars, and the low hum of wind moving through the grass like a restless spirit. In that silence, the camp of the great Khan glowed like a second constellation. Fires burning in circles, the silhouettes of warriors slouched over bowls of kumis, their laughter sharp and raw as steel, but the heart of the encampment pulsed with something darker. At the center rose a jur, larger than the rest, its frame bound with gilded ribs, its felt walls embroidered with dragons that seemed to coil when the wind shifted. It was here that the Khan slept, feasted, commanded, and it was here that the most terrible form of conquest took place. One that left no city in ruins, but left human souls shattered beyond repair. To the outside world, the Mongols were already a terror. They were the horsemen who had burned cities to ash, who turned rivers red with blood, who drove entire kingdoms into extinction. But inside the Golden Gur, power was measured not in arrows loosed or cities razed, but in how utterly a body could be broken. War ended at the gates. The real theatre of domination began when the Khan summoned women into his tent. A line of them could sometimes be seen, though no one dared to look too long. Captives taken from Persia, from China, from the cold lands of the Rus. Some were princesses, their silks torn and travel-stained. Some were peasant girls with calloused hands and hollow eyes. They wore robes of white, meant to signify purity. But among Mongol women, everyone knew the truth whispered behind their teeth. Those robes were the same garments used to wrap the dead. A bride's dress was a burial shroud. A wedding was a funeral for the self. When a woman stepped into the Khan's tent, she stepped into an empire of silence. The carpets muffled her steps. The braziers hissed with the smell of burning herbs. Guards stood like statues outside, not looking, not blinking, but always listening. Inside, the Khan sat cross-legged on cushions, his eyes glinting like an executioner's blade in the firelight. For him, this was not desire. It was law, and if law demanded her submission, then her body was no longer hers. Some women trembled, others stared at the ground until their necks ached. A few, daughters of kings, noble blood in their veins, tried to hold themselves with pride, only to find pride snapped like brittle bone beneath the weight of empire. Here, a refusal was not refusal, it was rebellion, and rebellion was death, not just for her, but for her family, for her people. A single night with the Khan could be the difference between a clan's survival or its annihilation. The chronicles that survive, Persian scribes, Chinese envoys, European friars, speak in voices tinged with horror. They describe harems numbering in the hundreds, women rotated through the Khan's tent like coins in a treasury. They speak of young captives paraded and inspected, their fate decided in the flicker of a single glance. They whisper of women who took their own lives rather than endure what awaited them, leaping from towers, swallowing poison, plunging knives into their chests. The Mongols were not the first conquerors to use women as spoils of war. But never before had the scale been so vast, the cruelty so systematic, the silence so absolute. Imagine the moment, the tent flap closing behind her, the world outside vanishing, the air heavy with the stink of sweat, horse leather and smoke. She kneels because she must, her body rigid, her heart battering itself against her ribs like a bird against a cage. The Khan does not ask. He commands with a gesture, with the weight of his gaze, and in that instant she understands. This is not about pleasure. It is about annihilation, about taking the last shred of freedom from a woman already robbed of her home, her family, her past. About making her womb the battlefield where conquest would continue, long after swords were sheathed. For the Mongol Khans, the empire was not only written in borders and banners, but in flesh. A dynasty could be extinguished by taking its princess as a concubine. A bloodline could be absorbed by forcing a queen to bear a Mongol child. Every union was political. Every embrace was a weapon, and behind every silken curtain lay the echo of countless silenced screams. History remembers the Mongols as warriors of the steppe, masters of siegecraft, unmatched in battle. But history also carries the shadows they left behind. Shadows that linger not in burned cities, but in the stories of women who lived or died inside the Khan's tent. Their names are forgotten, their faces lost. Yet the terror they endured still hangs over the chronicles like smoke from a fire that never quite dies. And so when we ask why the Mongol Khans were feared, we must look beyond the battlefield, beyond the bloodied swords and trampled fields. The true horror lay not only in how they conquered nations, but in how they conquered the most private corners of human life. The battlefield ended at the city walls, but for countless women the war began on the night they were summoned into the Golden Girth. And yet, to understand the horror of the Mongol Khans' private practices, we must first look at the empire they forged, an empire built not only on blood and fire, but on the bodies of those who survived. The Mongols were not content with victory on the battlefield. Their conquest seeped into every vein of life, extending far beyond the surrender of cities. For the women of the defeated, the war never ended. It followed them into captivity, into harems, into the suffocating silence of the Khan's tent. When a Mongol horde descended on a city, the pattern was merciless and precise. The gates were smashed open by thunderous rams, or the walls scaled by storming ladders, while drums pounded like a heartbeat of doom. Fires leapt from roof to roof, screams rose like smoke into the night sky, and when the last defenders fell, the sorting began. To the Mongols, people were resources to be harvested. No different than horses or grain, men who could fight were slaughtered in heaps. Skilled artisans, smiths, carpenters, engineers were spared, dragged into the machinery of empire. Children were taken as servants. But the women were measured by a different scale. Chroniclers from Persia, Rus, and China all describe the same grim ritual. Once a city was pacified, Mongol soldiers drove its women into open squares or courtyards, separating them from the ashes of their families. There, they were divided. The youngest, the most beautiful, the noble-born, were set aside for the Khan and his generals. The rest were parceled out to the soldiers as spoils, given away like plundered silk or stolen gold, and those deemed useless, too old, too worn, too defiant, were often killed on the spot, their cries smothered beneath the clash of armor and the whinny of horses. For the Khan, these women were more than concubines. They were trophies, proof that his power reached into the very bloodlines of rival dynasties. A captured princess was not merely a woman, she was a living emblem of her father's failure, her people's defeat. To take her body was to break an entire kingdom's spine. It was political theatre staged in flesh. Imagine the scene: a smoky courtyard after a city's fall, the ground littered with spent arrows and broken shields. Women stand in clusters, their eyes hollow, their silks torn. Some clutch children who are pried from their arms. A Mongol commander rides slowly before them, his gaze sharp as a blade. With a gesture of his whip, he indicates which ones will be taken for the Khan. The chosen collapse to their knees, not out of reverence, but despair. They know what awaits them. Behind the walls of the Golden Girth, survival will mean surrendering every shred of self. The scale of it was staggering. Chroniclers write of harems filled with hundreds of women drawn from every corner of the empire. Persian nobles, Chinese courtesans, Slavic maidens, steppe nomads. Some tents were said to echo with dozens of different languages, all bound together by the same silence of fear. At the center of this empire of flesh sat the Khan, whose appetite was treated as both natural law and divine mandate. His concubines were rotated like horses in a stable, summoned and dismissed at will, their lives suspended in a twilight where they existed not as people, but as instruments of his desire and power. Yet there was a hierarchy even in captivity. Noble women taken as prizes were sometimes forced into marriage to cement political alliances. A daughter of a defeated prince might be declared the Khan's wife, her union meant to pacify a conquered people. But in truth, the ceremony was little more than a gilded chain. Beneath the titles and gifts, her fate was the same: a body bound to the will of the conqueror. Lower-born women were rarely granted even that thin veneer of respect. They were concubines, disposable, easily replaced with the next wave of captives from the next burning city. There was no safety, no sanctuary, even death offered no guarantee of escape. A chilling custom among the Mongols ensured that when a nobleman died, his wives and concubines could be inherited by his brothers or sons. This practice, known as levirate marriage, meant that women were passed like property, traded from one man to another without consent. For the Khans, this was a way to consolidate power, to keep wealth and alliances within the clan. For the women, it was a second burial. their grief swallowed by yet another unwanted union. The brutality was not hidden, it was ritualized, normalized, absorbed into the fabric of Mongol power. For a people who believed conquest was destiny, the domination of women was seen as its natural extension. The battlefield ended at the city walls, but in truth it began again in the courtyards, in the harems, in the shadowed chambers where women were forced to kneel before men who saw themselves as rulers of the earth. What must it have felt like, to be dragged from the wreckage of your home, your family's body still warm in the streets, and shoved into a tent filled with strangers speaking tongues you did not know, to realize you were no longer a daughter, a wife, or a sister, but a spoil, a token, a vessel of humiliation. The silence in those tents was heavier than the screams outside, because outside, death was quick. Inside, it could last a lifetime. And yet, in this silence, a deeper horror lurked, for the Mongol Khans did not see these acts as sins. They saw them as strategies. Each body taken was another dynasty broken, another people bent, another empire sewn into the fabric of their own. Conquest was not measured only in land or gold. It was measured in the children born from these unions, half Mongol, half captive, children who carried the blood of both conqueror and conquered, their very existence a scar across history. This was the empire of flesh, not drawn on maps but on bodies, not recorded in treaties but in whispers and laments. The Khans built the largest land empire in history, but hidden beneath their banners of conquest was another empire, one of shadows and silence, one that stretched from the mountains of Persia to the rivers of China, an empire carved not only in stone and steel, but in the unwilling flesh of those who bore it. And for those women, the war never ended. It followed them into the night, into the Khan's tent, into the chambers where conquest became the most intimate and horrifying theatre of all. If the battlefield was fire and blood, then the Mongol court was ice and silence. For many women, the violence did not end when the swords were sheathed. It only transformed. It became ritual. It became spectacle. And it became humiliation, so carefully woven into custom that it seemed less like crime and more like ceremony. When a woman was chosen for the Khan, whether a noble princess taken to bind her father's people in submission, or a concubine ripped from the smoking ruins of a city, she did not simply walk into his tent. There was a process, a stripping away of dignity, layer by layer, until nothing remained but obedience. The chronicles speak in fragmented whispers, but together they paint a picture of a ritual that was as much about breaking the spirit as it was about satisfying desire. First, there was the examination. Women captured for the Khan were paraded before his retainers. Persian chroniclers described it with bitterness. Young girls lined up in open courtyards, forced to stand while officials inspected their faces, their hands, their bodies. Virginity was prized, and so tests were devised. Crude, invasive, degrading. The very act was meant to remind them, you are not a bride, you are a commodity. Then came the selection. A nod from the Khan, a flick of his hand, and a life was rewritten. Those chosen were led away into the shadows of the Golden Gur. Those rejected were handed to generals, or to soldiers, or to death. Every moment was a reminder that their fate was a gesture away, decided in silence by a man whose empire stretched farther than the horizon. Marriage, too, was not sacred. It was weaponized. When a Khan married the daughter of a defeated prince, it was not love or alliance. It was conquest draped in silk. The girl might be dressed in finery, adorned with jewels, her face painted as though she were entering a festive union, but beneath the gilded veils she walked into a cage. Her role was not wife. It was hostage, symbol, trophy. To share his bed was to remind her father and her people their lineage now lay beneath Mongol feet. And for widows, the humiliation never ended. The Mongols practiced what is called levirate marriage, a tradition where a widow could be claimed by her husband's brother or even his son. In theory, it was about preserving family ties. In practice, it was a prison with no escape. Imagine a girl of 17 married by force to a Mongol prince. He dies in battle months later, his body unrecognizable among the slain. She weeps, thinking perhaps her nightmare has ended. But no. She is told she now belongs to his uncle, an older man twice her age, whose breath reeks of fermented mare's milk and blood. The chain is passed from one hand to another. Her grief is consumed by fresh horror. She has not lost a husband. She has been recycled into another cage. Even the most private moment of intimacy was staged as theatre. There are accounts, some exaggerated, some perhaps painfully true, that women were made to bathe before guards, scrubbed like livestock, dressed in robes that signified both purity and surrender. When they entered the Khan's tent, they were often placed on their knees, their eyes forced downward. The ritual demanded silence. Words were forbidden. They were not allowed to speak, not allowed to refuse, not allowed to be human. But silence itself was not mercy. It was another blade. In that silence they were reminded that their voices no longer mattered, that the world would not hear their cries, nor would it remember their names. A bride's laughter, a wife's song, a woman's story. These were things burned away, leaving only the echo of submission. And then there were the punishments. Refusal was not tolerated. To resist was to insult the Khan. An insult demanded blood. There are stories of women who tried to flee, who screamed, who clawed at the ground in desperation. They were dragged back by soldiers, beaten, or executed before others as warning. In some cases, their families, if still alive, were killed in retribution. The message was clear: your body is not yours. It is empire's property. For the Mongol Khans, these acts were more than indulgence. They were rituals of humiliation, repeated night after night, year after year, until they became tradition. The Khan did not merely take women, he unmade them, and in their unmaking, he reminded all who looked upon him that no law, no faith, no kingdom could stand above him. The cruelty extended even into the dynastic heart. Rumors spread of incestuous unions, where the Khans bent the rules of kinship for convenience. Some took stepmothers, some cousins, some women already tied to others. What mattered was not morality, but dominance. Mongol law was the Khan's will, and his will could not be questioned. The very idea of forbidden bloodlines was bent to his desire. It is in these stories that the full horror emerges, not simply in the taking of women, but in the way it was codified, ritualized, wrapped in customs and ceremonies that disguised brutality as order. What looked like a wedding was really a shackle. What looked like silence was really a scream that history muffled. Now picture the moment through the eyes of one woman, a captured noble from the cities of Persia. She is dragged into a chamber lit by oil lamps, her wrists raw from bindings. Attendants strip her garments, bathe her in cold water, while soldiers watch with detached faces. A robe of white is draped across her shoulders. She knows what it means. She has been dressed like the dead. She is led to the Khan's tent, her feet sinking into carpets heavy with foreign dyes. Outside, drums thud to mark the Khan's evening ritual. Inside, the air is heavy with incense that stings her eyes. The Khan does not speak. He gestures. She kneels. And in that moment she feels herself vanish. Not killed, but erased. The woman she was is gone. What remains is a vessel. That was the true terror of these rituals. They did not only steal the body, they stole the self. To be taken into the Khan's tent was to have your past, your name, your identity stripped away until all that remained was silence and submission. For the Mongol Khans, humiliation was as important as victory. To strip a woman of dignity was to strip a kingdom of pride. To take her in silence was to force her people into silence. Every ritual was a performance, not for her, but for history. And history remembered. Not her laughter, not her love, not her song, but her silence. This was conquest at its darkest. Not the clash of swords or the burning of cities, but the systematic crushing of souls. A war fought in chambers instead of fields. A war that left no monuments, only shadows. Shadows that linger still, reminding us that the Mongol Empire was not only written in blood, but in the unspeakable rituals of humiliation endured by those who never chose to enter the Khan's tent. If the battlefield was chaos, the Khan's tent was order. An order of absolute control, where terror moved in silence and humiliation was orchestrated like ritual theatre. For outsiders, the golden ger of the great Khan was a marvel, its frame bound with gilded wood, its walls layered with embroidered felt and silk, the roof crowned with a bronze chimney that spat light into the night sky. Envoys wrote of its splendor, how jewels were sewn into carpets, how its poles shone with inlaid silver. But for the women who crossed its threshold, splendor was only a mask. Behind the glittering walls lay a chamber of shadows, where conquest became flesh and desire was sharpened into domination. The ritual began long before the Khan touched them. Women selected for him were brought to attendants who prepared them as though for sacrifice. They were bathed in basins of cold water, sometimes perfumed, more often not, scrubbed until their skin was raw. Their hair was combed, their bodies oiled, their faces powdered with crushed pearls or dusted with flour to make their skin pale. Some were perfumed with frankincense, others with the sour smell of fermented mare's milk, as if their scent should remind the Khan of his own people's earth. The process was not tender, it was clinical. As one Persian chronicler bitterly wrote, "They dressed them like brides, but treated them like cattle." After the cleansing came the dressing. Robes of white were draped across their shoulders, robes that symbolized purity to the court but whispered of death to the women themselves. Their waists were bound with silk sashes, their hands decorated with henna, not as an honor, but as a mark that they had been claimed. Some were forced to wear jewels from the very treasuries looted from their families, so that each step into the Khan's presence was a mockery of all they had lost. Then came the walk. They were escorted barefoot across carpets that muffled sound, through corridors lined with guards who did not speak or move. Every guard knew the law. No one looked at the women summoned for the Khan. To glance was to die. Silence pressed down heavier than any shout of violence. Outside the gur, men laughed, cups clinked, fires roared. But here, in this procession, the air was so thick it felt like drowning. Inside, the tent was vast, yet claustrophobic. Braziers burned low, filling the air with smoke that stung the eyes. The carpets were layered so deeply that footsteps vanished. Weapons hung on the walls. Curved sabers, bows wrapped in leather, quivers of arrows gleaming in the firelight, as though to remind every captive that she now knelt before the man who owned life and death. At the far end sat the Khan himself, cross-legged on a raised dais, a cup of kumi in his hand. His gaze was sharp, cold, the gaze of a man who had watched cities burn without blinking. No words were spoken. Women were trained, or forced, to keep their eyes down, their mouths shut. The Khan did not ask their names. He did not need to know who they were. To him, they were not daughters, not wives, not people. They were proof. Proof of conquest. Proof of power. Each body was a scroll on which his empire was written. What followed was not intimacy. It was theatre. The Khan often summoned multiple women in a single night, sometimes one after another, sometimes together. Chroniclers wrote that his tent became a revolving door of captives, attendants leading women in and out while guards stood watch to ensure silence. Some were dismissed after minutes, others forced to remain until dawn. The randomness itself was another weapon, keeping every woman on edge, never knowing how long her humiliation would last. A Persian historian described how a noble woman from Khwarazm was summoned before Ogday Khan. Her city had been razed, her father executed, her brothers slaughtered. She was bathed, perfumed, dressed in silks taken from her own palace. When she entered the Khan's tent, she collapsed to the ground, not from reverence but exhaustion. Ogday is said to have laughed, lifting her chin with a finger before dragging her into his bed. She was later dismissed, her silks torn, her eyes vacant. In that moment she was no longer a princess. She was evidence that her people were broken. There were worse tales. Juvaini, a Persian chronicler writing in the 13th century, describes Mongol women being forced into sexual tests by officials before being brought to the Khan, their bodies reduced to objects of inspection. Others tell of captives made to perform before retainers, singing, dancing, stripped of clothing, as though their humiliation were part of the entertainment of empire. To refuse was death, to weep was ignored, to survive meant silence, and yet silence did not mean safety. A woman could be summoned one night and discarded the next. Some were sent to the harems of generals, others were given as gifts to visiting allies. A few vanished altogether, their fates unrecorded, their names swallowed by history. For those who remained, the tent became a prison. They lived each day waiting for the summons, each night wondering if it would be their last. Incest, too, seeped into the folds of power. Rumors spread of Khans who claimed stepmothers, cousins, even widows of their fathers, in order to keep bloodlines under their control. It was less about desire and more about domination. To claim a woman tied by blood to another ruler was to claim that ruler's legacy. To the outside world it seemed unthinkable. To the Khans, it was strategy. And strategy excused everything. What must it have felt like to kneel on carpets that smelled of smoke and blood, to feel the weight of a man's eyes that had seen empires fall, to know your body was less yours than it was his proclamation of conquest? Each touch was not a caress but a brand, burning away the last remnants of freedom. And when dawn came, when the guards pulled back the tent flap and the cold air struck your skin, you were not yourself anymore. You were Empire's silence, Empire's shadow. Some tried to resist. Some clawed at the ground, screamed, begged for death instead. The punishment was swift. A blade across the throat, a spear through the chest. Others were spared but saw their families slaughtered in retribution. Word spread quickly. Refusal was not an option. Survival meant submission, even if it meant the death of the self. The Khan's tent was not just a chamber. It was the heart of a system where conquest was ritualized through flesh. It was where dynasties ended, not in battle, but in the slow suffocation of women forced into silence. Every night, another life extinguished in spirit, another lineage bent, another scream swallowed by heavy felt walls. History remembers the Mongol Khans as warriors, conquerors, empire builders, but history also remembers their tent. The braziers still flicker in the chronicles, the carpets still drink the silence of women whose names are lost. The jewels still glitter in the dark, as though mocking the pain they once adorned. The Khan's tent was a palace, a theatre, a tomb. For those who entered, it was the end of who they had been, and for the world beyond it was a message. Conquest does not end with the city's fall. It seeps into the night, into the chamber, into the very bodies of those who survive. The Mongol Empire was not just written on maps, it was written in flesh. And the ink was humiliation. For most captives summoned into the Khan's orbit, survival meant silence. Submission was the only shield, thin as paper, between them and annihilation. Yet not all could bear the weight of that silence. Some resisted. Some begged. Some chose death with their own hands rather than life in the Khan's tent. And those who defied, whether in thought, in word, or in trembling action, were made into warnings. The Mongols were masters of punishment. Their empire thrived on fear more than swords, and nowhere was this more brutally displayed than in the fates of women who refused the Khan. Persian chroniclers record with bitter clarity, women who dared resist were executed without delay. Sometimes a blade was drawn across the throat before they even crossed the tent's threshold. Sometimes they were dragged screaming into the courtyards and beaten until silence fell. Their blood was not wasted. It was a message. A whisper passed from captive to captive, resist and you vanish. But death did not always come swiftly. In some cases, refusal meant that not only the woman but her family paid the price. Envoys speak of daughters whose fathers were executed before their eyes for their hesitation, of mothers slain so that the daughters might learn that refusal was not an option. It was terror weaponized in the most intimate way, forcing a choice not between freedom and captivity, but between personal dignity and the survival of one's blood. To say no was to doom everyone you loved. To say yes was to bury yourself alive. Others chose a different path. Rather than allow the Khan to claim them, they claimed their own deaths. Chinese sources speak of noblewomen who flung themselves into rivers as Mongol troops stormed their palaces. Persian poets mourned princesses who leapt from fortress walls, their veils streaming like broken banners before they struck the earth. The Russian chronicles tell of women who slit their throats with kitchen knives or shards of broken glass, staining their own wedding robes with blood so they would never be touched. These women were remembered not as wives or concubines, but as martyrs of defiance. Their final breath, a refusal sharper than any sword. Yet suicide was not always possible. For many, the choice came too quickly, the tent flap drawn back before they could find a blade or leap from a wall. For them, the only options were submission or execution by the Khan's guards. Those who submitted lived, but they did not survive as themselves. Their names were stripped away, their voices were silenced. They became shadows in silk, drifting through the Khan's camp like ghosts who still breathe. And in many ways they envied the dead. The story preserved in Persian history tells of a noble woman from Nishapur, taken during the Mongol massacre of 1221. Her family had been slaughtered, her city reduced to rubble. When she was chosen for the Khan, she spat in his face. For a moment, silence gripped the tent. Then his guards seized her. She was dragged outside and cut down before the waiting soldiers, her head displayed on a spear. That act of defiance lasted seconds, but it reverberated across generations. Chroniclers recorded it not as a triumph but as a tragedy, a reminder of the futility of resistance. There were also women who submitted outwardly, but died inwardly, killing themselves in slower ways. Some refused food. Some whispered prayers until their voices faded into nothing. Others lived only for the chance to smuggle poison into their mouths. A captured Rus maiden was said to have swallowed crushed aconite hidden in her sleeve, collapsing in the Khan's tent before he could touch her. Her body was dragged out like refuse, but in her death she reclaimed what little control was left to her. Submission itself was not safety. The Khan's attention was fickle, and a concubine could be discarded at will. Some women were sent to generals' harems, others were gifted to visiting allies as tokens of goodwill. A few were executed for no reason at all, their deaths mere gestures to remind the living of their place. The paradox was brutal. To resist was to die. To submit was to live, but without dignity, without self, without the faintest echo of freedom. And so a new form of survival was born, survival by silence. Women learned to move without sound, to breathe without protest, to bury their memories so deeply they almost ceased to exist. Some raised children fathered by the Khans, children who carried the blood of both conqueror and conquered. For those women, survival meant a lifetime of watching their child grow into the very lineage that had destroyed their own. Their wombs became the battlefield where defeat was inscribed for eternity. The psychological terror was perhaps the cruelest cut. Every woman summoned knew that her body was no longer her own. She belonged to empire. And empire demanded not only obedience but complicity. Her silence made her a part of the performance, her stillness proof that the Khan's will was absolute. Every breath she took was an act of submission. Every day she woke was a reminder that she had been conquered in the deepest way imaginable. What then was death? For some it was freedom, for others it was despair. For all it was a choice that echoed louder than any battle drum. To step into the Khan's tent was to enter a chamber where no answer could save you. Submission stole your soul. Defiance stole your life. And the Khan, seated cross-legged on his silken dais, watched with cold eyes as women chose between the blade and the silence, knowing that either way victory was his. This was the darkest truth of the Mongol Empire. Conquest did not end when the walls of a city crumbled. It continued in the most intimate chambers, in the forced choices of women stripped of voice, of power, of hope. Death or submission, blade or silence, there was no third path. And in that truth lies the deepest scar left by the Khans. Not only the ruined cities, not only the shattered dynasties, but the countless women who died in silence or who lived as shadows, erased while still breathing. On the battlefield, Mongol cruelty was swift. A sword flashed, a city burned, a river ran red, but in the quiet that followed, another war began, one slower, more suffocating, and infinitely more horrifying. It was a war fought inside women's bodies. The Khans did not stop at conquering cities, they conquered wombs. They turned pregnancy into policy. They made childbirth itself into a theatre of humiliation. For the Mongol Khans, a woman's body was more than plunder. It was a weapon of empire. When a princess was forced into the Khan's tent, she knew what awaited her. Not only the humiliation of the night, but the terror of what might follow. A child she never wanted. A child whose very heartbeat meant that her family's bloodline no longer belonged to her people. Her womb became a battlefield where dynasties were erased and rewritten. Every pregnancy was a proclamation. Your empire is dead. Mine lives in your belly. Persian accounts describe noblewomen dragged across the steppes, swollen with children they could not love. They had been married once with ceremony and joy, but now they were bound to their captors by chains no one could see. Each month their bodies betrayed them, their bellies rising like a monument to submission. When they gave birth, the midwives whispered in Mongol, not their mother tongue. Their children's first cries were not greeted with celebration, but with silence heavy as the grave. Chinese chronicles record concubines taken from palaces and installed in Mongol harems, forced to bear sons who would one day rule their own homelands. Imagine the horror. A woman, once meant to be empress of her people, now nursing the child of her people's executioner. That child would grow, his Mongol blood legitimized by her suffering, and one day sit in judgment over the very land his mother once dreamed of protecting. To rock him in her arms was to cradle her conqueror's victory. Every lullaby became a dirge. The womb was no longer sacred. It was desecrated, occupied, remade as a weapon. Women did not pray for healthy sons. They prayed for stillbirths. Some starved themselves, hoping to choke the life inside before it drew breath. Others sought poison, smuggling crushed herbs into their mouths. But guards watched. Attendants intervened. A child was not only flesh, it was the Khan's proof, his legacy, his cruelty written in bloodlines. And so the pregnancies continued, relentless as the hoofbeats of Mongol horses across the earth. Some women killed their own newborns. Persian poets whisper of mothers who smothered infants with trembling hands, tears streaming, believing it kinder to let them die than to grow as reminders of conquest. Others threw themselves into rivers while still pregnant, their bodies vanishing beneath dark waters, choosing death for both mother and child rather than submit to raising the future of their destroyers. Such acts were remembered as desperate flames of defiance, but they were rare. Most were not given the chance. The empire guarded its unborn heirs more fiercely than its gold. And the children themselves, what horrors they embodied. They were walking monuments to conquest. Half captive, half conqueror, they carried in their veins both the lineage of kingdoms extinguished and the blood of the men who destroyed them. To the Mongols, they were heirs, proof that their dominion stretched not only across land, but through generations. To their mothers, they were mirrors of torment. To gaze upon a child's face and see the features of the man who had slaughtered your family was to relive the night of your undoing every morning. A Rus chronicle tells of a princess forced into the harem of Batu Khan. She bore a son whose eyes mirrored his father's. Each time she looked at him, she saw the man who had burned her city and hung her brothers from the gates. She fed him, clothed him, taught him to walk, yet with every step he took, she felt her people's defeat walking beside him. To hold him was both love and poison. She could not hate him, he was her blood, but she could not love him either, for he was empire's scar carved into her flesh. The Mongols understood this psychological cruelty. They did not need to burn cities twice. The children were the second burning. They were living flames, reminders that resistance was futile. Even if you survived the siege, even if your body lived, your womb could not escape. Your future would be bound to the empire whether you willed it or not. This strategy was not incidental. It was deliberate. Genghis Khan himself is believed to have fathered hundreds of children, his seeds scattered across continents like ash after fire. Modern genetic studies suggest that as many as 16 million men alive today may carry his Y chromosome. To some, this is spoken of as legacy, but behind that number lies a graveyard of silenced women. 16 million descendants are not a triumph. They are 16 million echoes of nights where women had no choice, no voice, no escape. And the cruelty of it was generational. A mother might live long enough to see her son, born of violence, rise as a Mongol governor over her homeland. A daughter, fathered by the Khan, might be married off to another ally, perpetuating the same cycle of humiliation. The blood of the conquered became the fuel of the conqueror's rule, and women were forced to watch their own children enforce the chains that bound them. Picture the silence of such a night. A Persian princess, belly heavy, kneels alone in a tent. Outside the camp roars with laughter, men drunk on fermented milk, celebrating conquest. Inside she cradles the curve of her stomach and whispers to the child she never asked for. She begs it not to be born, not to live, not to carry the blood that will erase her people. But the child stirs and she knows it will come. And when it does, the empire will laugh again, because her suffering has become their victory. This was the deepest horror of the Mongol Khans. They turned motherhood itself into enslavement. They turned the act of giving life into a sentence of death for entire cultures. They stole not only women's bodies, but their futures, their legacies, their very bloodlines. Every cry of a newborn in a Mongol camp was both the birth of a child and the burial of a dynasty. Conquest did not end at the city walls, it continued in the womb, and for the women who bore the children of their conquerors, there was no escape, no forgetting, no end. Their bodies were conquered twice, once by the sword and once by the child they carried. And the empire was built not only on broken stones and burned cities, but on broken women, forced to raise the very heirs of their own destruction. History often remembers the Mongols in numbers, 100,000 horsemen, cities of 1 million reduced to ash, rivers running red for miles. But the most horrifying truths cannot be measured. They are not written in chronicles of conquest or on the bones buried beneath fields. They live in silence, in the silence of women whose voices were stolen, whose names were forgotten, whose bodies became the canvas upon which empire scrawled its victory. That silence is the true sound of the Mongol Empire, louder than hooves, sharper than arrows. The silence of the Khan's tent, where women knelt with heads bowed, unable to speak, unable to scream. The silence of courtyards where sisters were divided, mothers torn from daughters. The silence of the womb, where children grew not out of love, but out of domination. It is a silence that lingers still, echoing like wind across the empty steppes. What does it mean to be erased while still alive? To breathe, to eat, to carry a child in your belly, and yet to feel as though you no longer exist. For the women taken into the Khan's tent, life became a shadow. They lived without being allowed to live. They survived only as symbols of submission, stripped of the right to even shape their own memory. To die would have been final, but to live in silence was a death that repeated itself every day. Picture her. The princess who once walked through her palace halls, golden bracelets jingling on her wrists, her laughter filling courtyards. Now she kneels in silence, a robe of white clinging to her like a shroud. She has not died, but she has been buried. Buried beneath the weight of empire, beneath the hands that claim her body, beneath the knowledge that even her womb has been conquered. Her lineage, her ancestors, her people, they all end here, not on the battlefield, but inside her own skin. This was the greatest cruelty. The war did not stop when the killing stopped. It continued in the most private corners of existence. It entered bedrooms, invaded pregnancies, haunted mothers as they rocked children born of violation. It lived on in lullabies sung with tears instead of joy. Every child's cry became a reminder of conquest, every smile a scar. And yet, what do we do with this memory? We live in a world that often romanticizes the Mongols as warriors, as tacticians, as empire builders. Their legacy is told in maps, in tales of strategy, in admiration for their ferocity. But behind those maps, behind those strategies, behind that ferocity, are the shadows of the women who bore the true weight of empire. Women who had no armies, no swords, no voice, but who carried in their bodies the deepest wounds of conquest. It is easy to speak of Genghis Khan's legacy as vast, to say he fathered countless children, that his blood runs in millions today, but to speak of it this way is to erase the horror behind it. His legacy was written in the silence of women who never chose him. His children were born not of triumph, but of terror. Every drop of his bloodline is a reminder that empire is not only drawn on maps, but carved into flesh. The emotional weight of this history cannot be calculated. It exists in the absence of stories. For every chronicler who recorded numbers of the dead, who marveled at Mongol brutality and war, how many voices of women were lost? How many lives folded into silence, unnamed, unremembered? They are not written in chronicles because the world did not see them as worth remembering. And so, their silence remains our burden to hear. Perhaps the deepest horror is this: the women who lived, who bore children, who sang to them in whispered voices. They loved them. They had no choice. Love and pain intertwined until they became inseparable. To nurse a child was to nurture both life and humiliation. To smile at a baby was to smile at your own defeat. This paradox consumed them. They could not reject their children, but they could not forget how those children had come to be. And so they lived with a wound that never healed, because the wound had a heartbeat, a face, a future. History books call this empire magnificent. But magnificence is measured in steel and land. Horror is measured in hearts broken without witness. In the women who drowned, their songs so deeply that the earth itself seemed to carry their silence. In the wombs turned into battlefields, where conquest stretched across generations. And so the question remains, what is the true legacy of the Mongol Khans? Is it the vast sweep of their empire across Eurasia, the brilliance of their strategy, the reach of their trade routes? Or is it the silence of women whose names we will never know, whose tears watered the very ground upon which that empire stood? Perhaps it is both. But the balance between them is not equal. For while cities can be rebuilt, while nations can rise again, the voices of those women are gone forever. Their silence cannot be undone. Close your eyes and imagine the steppe at night. The fires of the Khan's camp burn low. The laughter of men fades. And somewhere, in the golden gyre at the center, a woman kneels in silence, her heart breaking against her ribs. Outside, the empire stretches across half the world. Inside, one life is erased. That is the image history does not tell. That is the sound we must learn to hear. The silence that screams across centuries. The Mongol Khans conquered the world, but in doing so they conquered something far darker, the private dignity of human life. And the empire they built was not only an empire of land, it was an empire of shadows, of wounds turned into graves, of songs drowned in silence. That empire has long since vanished, but its ghosts remain, whispering in the silence of history, reminding us that the greatest horror of conquest is not in the cities burned, but in the lives broken beyond memory. The story of the Mongol Khans is often told in triumph, a tale of horsemen who rode farther, faster, harder than any army in history, a tale of empires broken, kingdoms swallowed, borders erased. We admire their ruthlessness, their strategy, their ferocity. We speak of them as if they were gods of war, unshakable, unchallenged, inevitable. But to tell only that story is to tell a lie, because the truest legacy of the Mongol Khans is not measured in maps or victories. It is measured in silence. In the silence of women whose bodies became the darkest battlefield of all. That silence is the empire's deepest scar. It is the echo of a princess stripped of her lineage, dressed in white as though for burial, forced to kneel in a tent where her womb would no longer belong to her but to her conqueror. It is the echo of a captive girl, bathed and perfumed against her will, paraded before guards who looked without seeing, chosen with a flick of a hand. It is the echo of a mother rocking a child she never wanted, whispering lullabies that felt more like funeral prayers. The horror of the Mongol Khans was not only in the burning of cities or the rivers filled with corpses, it was in the quiet chambers where women died without dying, where the self was torn out of them and replaced with silence, where their wombs became tombs for dynasties, coffins for memory, graves where entire bloodlines were buried alive. There are numbers we can recite. We can say Genghis Khan's blood flows in millions of men today. We can say whole kingdoms collapsed beneath Mongol hooves. But behind those numbers are faces that history refuses to record. Women whose cries were smothered by carpets. Women whose defiance ended with blades at their throats. Women whose silence became the lullaby of empire. Their names are gone, their stories erased. They were buried not in earth, but in oblivion. And perhaps that is the most horrifying violence of all, that we remember the men who conquered, but we forget the women who were conquered twice, once by the sword and again by silence. Think of what conquest means when it seeps into the most private spaces of life. To take a city is one thing. To take a woman's voice, her womb, her future, her very self, that is conquest beyond conquest. It is the theft of humanity. It is turning love into violation, birth into defeat, motherhood into slavery. It is to make the body itself a prison from which there is no escape. And for what? For legacy? For empire? For a lineage written not in honor, but in the tears of women who never had a choice? When we look at the vastness of the Mongol Empire, we must see what lies beneath its banners. Shadows. Shadows of women who lived without living, who breathed without being alive, who carried in their bellies the proof that conquest had stolen not only their present, but their future. Close your eyes and return to the steppe at night. The fires have burned low, the warriors have fallen silent, and at the center, the golden gyre glows faintly, its walls trembling with the sound of muffled cries. Inside, a woman kneels. She knows her fate. She knows her body will be broken, her voice erased, her womb turned into empire's parchment. and she knows the world will never speak her name. Outside, the stars blaze brilliantly above the endless grasslands, but inside, one life collapses into silence. That silence is the truest measure of the Mongol Khans. Not the size of their empire, not the brilliance of their tactics, but the countless voices they extinguished, the cries they forced back into throats, the lullabies turned into laments. Their empire was not only written in blood, it was written in silence, in humiliation, in the unmarked graves of women's dignity. And that silence still lingers. It lingers in the statistics that reduce horror to numbers. It lingers in the absence of names, the blank spaces where stories should be. It lingers every time we speak of conquest and forget those who bore its most intimate scars. It is a silence that accuses, a silence that screams louder than any battle drum. The Mongol Khans are long dead. Their banners have rotted, their tents are dust, their empire has crumbled into history. But the silence remains. It remains in the soil where their horses trampled, in the rivers where women leapt rather than submit, in the lullabies that once echoed in trembling voices. It remains as a ghostly reminder that conquest is not glorious. It is not magnificent. It is horror wrapped in silence, written into bodies, carved into futures that were never meant to be. And so, when we speak of the Mongol Empire, we must strip away the romantic veil. We must remember not only the cities they destroyed, but the lives they hollowed out. We must remember the women whose silence built the true foundation of empire. And we must remember that the greatest victories of the Khans were not on battlefields but in the suffocating silence of their tents, where humanity itself was conquered, where wombs were turned into graves, and where voices were buried deeper than the dead. That is the legacy. Not glory, not greatness, but silence. Silence that claws at the skin, silence that suffocates the soul, silence that, centuries later, still screams.